I used to believe the most valuable things in life could be locked inside a vault until one rainy afternoon proved that the greatest treasures often hang from an ordinary thread around an ordinary neck. The rain had finally begun to fade over the quiet streets outside Boston, leaving behind silver reflections that shimmered across cracked sidewalks and puddles stretching beneath glowing streetlights. Inside a small neighborhood diner, Emily Brooks wiped the last coffee mug of her evening shift while the familiar sound of old country music drifted softly through the nearly empty room. She smiled at the elderly couple finishing apple pie in the corner before hanging her apron beside the kitchen door. The owner thanked her as he always did, reminding her not to forget the leftover soup waiting in the refrigerator. Emily thanked him, collected the small paper bag, and stepped outside into the cool October air. She never imagined the next 10 minutes would quietly reshape two lives that had traveled separate roads for more than 30 years. About half a mile away, a sleek dark blue luxury sedan rolled to an unexpected stop beside a narrow roadside lined with maple trees. Ethan Calloway rested both hands on the steering wheel as warning lights illuminated the dashboard. He frowned with quiet frustration. Meetings worth millions of dollars had never unsettled him, yet an engine refusing to start on an empty suburban road somehow managed to do exactly that. He stepped out into the damp evening wearing a charcoal overcoat over a tailored navy suit. The air smelled of wet leaves and fresh rain. He lifted the hood and stared at an engine that looked far more complicated than anything he intended to touch. Several passing drivers slowed for a brief moment before continuing on their way. Ethan reached for his phone only to discover there was almost no signal. He let out a quiet breath and looked toward the darkening road. That was when he noticed a young woman walking calmly beneath a worn umbrella while carrying a small paper bag. She slowed as she noticed the open hood. Most people would have offered sympathy before continuing home. Emily did something different. She walked closer and asked one simple question. "Would you like me to take a look?" Ethan almost smiled at the unexpected suggestion. "You know engines?" Emily nodded gently. "My father owned a small repair shop before I was old enough to reach the workbench. I learned by handing him tools before I learned algebra." There was no arrogance in her voice. Only quiet confidence. Ethan stepped aside without another word. Emily carefully placed the paper bag beneath a nearby tree to keep it dry before leaning over the engine compartment. Raindrops rested on the metal surface while faint steam drifted upward. She studied the engine for less than a minute before checking one loose connection hidden beneath a protective cover. Her hands moved with patient familiarity. She asked Ethan to sit behind the wheel and try the ignition once more. The engine hesitated for a second before smoothly coming back to life. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. He stepped out again with an expression that rarely appeared during board meetings or business negotiations. That was impressive. Emily simply smiled. Sometimes the smallest part stops the biggest machine. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a leather wallet. Emily quietly shook her head before he could speak. "Please do not." He paused. "You saved me a long night. Then saying thank you is enough." She picked up her paper bag and turned toward the sidewalk. As she adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag, the silver necklace beneath her light sweater slipped into view. A small oval pendant rested against the fabric for only a second before disappearing again. Ethan froze. Something inside him tightened without explanation. He had seen that pendant before. Not recently. Not even as an adult. Somewhere much deeper. Somewhere inside a childhood memory that refused to fully return. Emily offered one final polite smile before continuing toward the neighborhood where porch lights slowly came alive one by one beneath the fading rain clouds. Ethan remained standing beside his now perfectly running car, watching her disappear into the quiet evening while his thoughts stayed fixed on the glimpse of worn silver hanging around her neck. He could not remember where he had seen it, but for the first time in many years, a memory he believed had disappeared forever had quietly begun finding its way back. Some memories do not return all at once. They wait patiently until one ordinary moment unlocks a door that has remained closed for years. Ethan Calloway drove home through quiet Boston streets with the image of the small silver pendant refusing to leave his thoughts. The city lights blurred beyond the windshield while rain continued falling in a soft rhythm across the glass. He had attended international conferences, signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and met countless influential people, yet none of those moments followed him home the way that simple necklace had. The memory remained incomplete, like a photograph with its most important corner missing. When he entered the Calloway estate, the familiar warmth of the fireplace greeted him as his mother, Margaret Calloway, sat comfortably in the library reading beneath a brass floor lamp. She looked up with a gentle smile. "You are later than usual." Ethan loosened his tie before sitting across from her. "My car decided it preferred the side of the road tonight." Margaret laughed softly. "That sounds expensive." Ethan smiled for the first time that evening. It would have been if someone had not stopped to help. He reached for his phone and opened a photograph he had quietly taken after Emily walked away. The image was not perfect. It simply showed the back of a young waitress walking beneath a faded umbrella while the silver pendant rested briefly against her sweater. Ethan enlarged the photograph and placed the phone on the table. "Does this necklace look familiar to you?" Margaret adjusted her reading glasses before leaning closer. The moment her eyes settled on the pendant, every trace of color slowly disappeared from her face. Her hand froze above the screen. She did not speak immediately. She simply stared as though 30 years had quietly returned without asking permission. Ethan noticed the change at once. "Mother?" She looked at him with eyes filled by memories instead of surprise. "Where did you see this?" "A waitress helped repair my car tonight." Margaret continued looking at the photograph. "Her name?" "Emily Brooks." Margaret whispered the name once, almost to herself. It meant nothing to Ethan, yet somehow it seemed to mean everything to her. She gently touched the image without actually placing her fingers against the screen. "I gave a necklace exactly like this to someone many years ago." Ethan sat forward. "Who?" Margaret slowly leaned back into her chair. The firelight reflected across the old family portraits surrounding the room. "A young mechanic named Daniel Brooks." Ethan frowned. "Brooks?" She nodded. "He worked in a small repair shop outside Boston. Your father met him after a highway accident many years before you were born." Ethan waited patiently. His mother rarely revisited the past unless it carried genuine meaning. "I thought the necklace had disappeared forever." Ethan quietly asked, "What made it special?" Margaret smiled with gentle sadness. "It was not expensive. It was simply the last gift my grandmother ever gave me. I wore it almost every day until I met Daniel." She paused as though carefully choosing each word. "He refused payment after helping your father during a terrible storm. Your father offered money. Daniel refused every dollar. Before we left I removed the necklace and gave it to him because it was the only way I could convince him to accept anything." Ethan looked once more at the photograph. Emily said her father owned a repair shop. Margaret closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. "Then I think I know whose daughter she may be." Silence settled gently across the library. The rain outside seemed quieter now, replaced by the steady ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing near the staircase. Ethan spoke first. "If that is true, why have we never heard about this family?" Margaret lowered her eyes toward the fire. "Because after your father recovered, we tried to find Daniel again. The repair shop had closed. No forwarding address. No records. He simply disappeared from our lives." Ethan stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the dark gardens. Something inside him refused to believe this could all be coincidence. A broken car. A waitress who understood engines. A surname that matched a forgotten memory. A silver necklace that should never have existed outside his mother's jewelry box. Margaret quietly folded her hands together. Find her again. Ethan turned back toward his mother. Why? She smiled with quiet certainty. Because I have spent more than 30 years wondering what became of the man who taught our family that kindness could never be measured with money. If that young woman truly carries his necklace, then she may also carry a story we were never meant to lose. Outside the rain finally stopped, leaving only the moonlight shining across the wet stone walkway, while miles away Emily unlocked the small apartment she called home, completely unaware that the silver pendant she had worn every day since childhood had just awakened a forgotten promise buried deep inside another family's past. The smallest questions often uncover the largest truths. Ethan Calloway arrived at the neighborhood diner just after sunrise, long before the breakfast crowd filled the booths. Steam drifted from fresh coffee while soft music played quietly through the speakers. Emily Brooks stood behind the counter arranging homemade muffins inside a glass display case exactly as she did every morning. She noticed Ethan immediately and smiled with polite surprise. "Your car is still running?" she asked with quiet humor. Ethan returned the smile. "Perfectly." He ordered a simple breakfast instead of introducing himself as one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. Emily treated him exactly as she treated every customer who walked through the door. She refilled coffee before he asked, remembered his preference for scrambled eggs after hearing it only once, and checked on an elderly veteran sitting alone before returning to Ethan's table. Nothing about her behavior changed because of expensive clothing or confidence. She simply believed every person deserved the same kindness. After breakfast Ethan thanked her again for helping him the previous evening. Emily brushed aside the compliment with a gentle smile. "My father always said that knowledge becomes worthless if it only helps yourself." Ethan paused. "Your father repaired cars?" Emily nodded while collecting empty plates. "For nearly 30 years. He owned a small repair shop outside the city until he became ill." Ethan felt another quiet piece of the puzzle slide into place. Before he could continue, another customer called Emily's name from across the room. She excused herself and hurried away. Ethan remained seated for several minutes watching the easy rhythm of her work. She never rushed, yet nothing remained unfinished. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed empty coffee cups before anyone asked for another refill. She carried herself with calm confidence that did not seek attention. When the breakfast rush finally slowed, Ethan stood beside the counter. "Would you have a few minutes after your shift?" Emily looked curious but untroubled. "That depends. My mother would like to meet you." Emily blinked in surprise. "Your mother?" Ethan nodded honestly. "She believes she may recognize the necklace you wear." Emily instinctively touched the small silver pendant resting beneath her uniform. For a brief moment her expression softened with memory. "I have worn this since I was a little girl. Would you consider bringing it with you?" She smiled gently. "It has never left me." Late that afternoon Ethan drove Emily to the Calloway estate. The long tree-lined driveway and elegant stone residence looked like something from another world compared with the modest apartment Emily called home. Yet she stepped inside with quiet composure rather than intimidation. Margaret Calloway waited near the sunlit conservatory holding a small wooden jewelry box. The moment Emily entered the room, Margaret's eyes settled on the silver pendant resting against her sweater. She slowly approached without speaking. "May I see it?" Emily carefully unclasped the necklace and placed it into Margaret's hands. The older woman's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she opened the pendant. Inside rested a tiny faded photograph of a smiling young couple. Margaret closed her eyes. "I remember this picture." Emily looked genuinely surprised. "You have seen it before?" Margaret nodded. "I placed it there myself." Silence filled the room. Ethan watched both women with growing disbelief. Margaret gently returned the necklace before walking toward an old bookshelf. From the top shelf she removed a worn leather photo album that had not been opened in many years. She carefully turned several pages until she reached a photograph taken decades earlier. A young mechanic stood beside a weathered pickup truck wearing an easy smile. Around his neck hung the exact same silver pendant. Emily's breath caught. "That is my father." Margaret smiled through tears that refused to fall. "Daniel Brooks never told you where it came from?" Emily slowly shook her head. "He only said it belonged to someone who believed gratitude should always be remembered." Before anyone could speak again, footsteps echoed quietly from the hallway. Richard Sloane, the longtime family attorney and trusted advisor to the Callaways, had arrived carrying several legal folders. He glanced toward the open photo album, then toward the necklace resting in Emily's hands. His expression changed almost too quickly to notice, but Ethan saw it. Surprise came first. Then concern. Then something that looked dangerously close to fear. Richard immediately recovered his usual calm smile and greeted everyone politely, yet his eyes returned to the necklace one final time before looking away. No one else appeared to notice, but Ethan did. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he suddenly realized that the mystery surrounding Emily's necklace was no longer just about a forgotten act of kindness. Someone had spent many years hoping that necklace would never be recognized again. The past does not disappear simply because people stop speaking about it. It waits quietly until someone finds the courage to open the door that was deliberately left closed. Richard Sloane remained calm throughout the evening, but the moment he returned to his office inside the Callaway Foundation building, his composed expression slowly disappeared. He closed the door, locked it, and stood silently before a wall of neatly organized filing cabinets. His eyes rested on one drawer that had not been opened in decades. After a long hesitation, he removed a small brass key from his wallet and unlocked the cabinet. Inside rested a weathered document box covered with a thin layer of dust. Richard gently lifted the lid and stared at old folders marked with faded dates from more than 30 years earlier. Among them lay a sealed envelope carrying one handwritten name. Daniel Brooks. Richard closed the box almost immediately, as though simply seeing the name had become dangerous. Across the city, Emily returned to her apartment carrying more questions than answers. She carefully placed the silver necklace on her kitchen table before preparing a cup of tea. For the first time in many years, she examined every tiny scratch across the oval pendant. Her father had always told her to protect it, but he never explained why. As a little girl she accepted the mystery without question because children often believe that some answers naturally belong to adulthood. Now adulthood had arrived, and the questions remained exactly where they had always been. She opened the pendant once more and looked at the tiny faded photograph inside. The smiling young couple had always been strangers to her. Tonight, one of those strangers finally had a name. Margaret Callaway. Early the next morning, Ethan visited his mother before leaving for work. Margaret stood beside the conservatory windows watering orchids while morning sunlight filled the room with soft golden light. Ethan quietly asked the question that had occupied his thoughts all night. "What happened after my father met Daniel Brooks?" Margaret slowly placed the watering can aside. "Your father spent months trying to find him again." Ethan looked surprised. "Months?" She nodded. "Daniel refused every reward. He disappeared before we even learned very much about him. Your father believed that kindness deserved gratitude, not because gratitude could repay it, but because gratitude honored it." Ethan folded his hands thoughtfully. "Then why did everyone stop looking?" Margaret's gentle smile slowly faded. "Because someone convinced your father that Daniel had moved across the country and wanted no further contact." Ethan frowned. "Who told him that?" Margaret answered almost immediately. "Richard Sloane." Silence settled between them. Neither wanted to jump toward conclusions, yet both recognized the uncomfortable connection. Ethan remembered Richard's brief reaction when he saw the necklace. It had lasted only a second, but now that second felt impossible to ignore. Instead of confronting Richard immediately, Ethan chose another path. He quietly instructed his executive assistant to locate every archived business record, newspaper clipping, property deed, and legal document connected to Daniel Brooks and the old repair shop. He wanted facts before accusations. Meanwhile, Emily spent her afternoon cleaning a small storage room inside her apartment building. Hidden behind old winter coats and several dusty boxes stood a wooden trunk that had belonged to her father. She had not opened it since his funeral because the memories had always felt too heavy. Today something urged her forward. Inside rested neatly folded work shirts, faded mechanic gloves, several family photographs, and an old leather journal tied together with a worn blue ribbon. Emily carefully untied the ribbon and opened the first page. Most entries described ordinary life inside the repair shop, difficult customers, long hours, and grateful neighbors. Then one folded sheet slipped quietly onto the floor. It was an unfinished letter written in her father's careful handwriting. The date matched the same year Margaret believed he had disappeared. Emily slowly unfolded the fragile paper. "My dear Margaret and Thomas, I hope this letter reaches you before rumors do. There are people who believe our meeting should remain forgotten. I do not understand why, but strange questions have begun surrounding the accident. If anything prevents me from seeing you again, please know your friendship has already been more valuable than any reward you ever offered." Emily stopped reading as her heartbeat quietly quickened. The remaining page had been torn away many years earlier. Only half the message remained. At that exact moment, Ethan received a call from the company archivist. One forgotten warehouse had finally yielded a shipment of unopened records from the original Callaway offices. Among dozens of dusty boxes sat another sealed envelope addressed to Thomas Callaway in Daniel Brooks's handwriting. Neither Ethan nor Emily realized they were now holding opposite halves of the very same letter, and somewhere inside Richard Sloane's locked cabinet rested the missing pages that explained why those two pieces had been separated for more than 30 years. The truth does not become more valuable when it is discovered. It simply becomes impossible to ignore. Ethan Callaway arrived at the company archive before sunrise while the city was still wrapped in quiet morning mist. Dust floated through narrow beams of light as the archivist carefully placed a weathered storage box onto a long wooden table. Inside rested decades of forgotten correspondence tied together with fading cloth ribbons. Near the bottom lay a sealed envelope addressed to Thomas Callaway in Daniel Brooks's unmistakably careful handwriting. The envelope had never been opened. Ethan studied the worn paper for several seconds before carefully breaking the brittle seal. Margaret sat quietly beside him, her hands folded together with patient anticipation. The letter began with warm gratitude, thanking Thomas and Margaret for their friendship and insisting once again that no reward had ever been necessary. Then the words slowly changed. Daniel explained that unusual visitors had begun asking questions about the highway accident where he first met the Callaways. Someone had repeatedly offered him money to leave town and forget the entire event. Daniel refused every offer because he believed honesty should never have a price. The final paragraph ended abruptly. The remaining page was missing. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. "Emily found the beginning," he whispered. "We found the ending." Margaret looked toward him with quiet concern. Then someone separated them on purpose. Across town, Emily carried her father's journal inside a canvas shoulder bag as she walked toward the diner before her afternoon shift. She could not stop thinking about the unfinished letter. During her lunch break she visited the neighborhood public library where local historical newspapers had been digitized. Hours passed as she searched through old records about her father's repair shop. Most articles described ordinary business advertisements until one small notice caught her attention. Daniel Brooks announces permanent shop closure. The article claimed he had accepted an opportunity in another state and planned to relocate immediately. Emily frowned. Her father had never mentioned leaving Massachusetts. In fact, they had remained in the same small apartment until the day he passed away. The newspaper story simply was not true. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly requested every surviving business contract involving Richard Sloane from that same period. His legal department discovered something unexpected. Around the exact time Daniel disappeared from public records, Richard had personally authorized the purchase of the land where Daniel's repair shop once stood. The transaction had been completed through a separate holding company that no longer existed. The purchase price was unusually low. Ethan stared at the documents in thoughtful silence. The timing no longer looked like coincidence. That evening he invited Emily and Margaret to the Calloway estate. Instead of offering explanations, Ethan placed both halves of Daniel's letter side by side on the library table. Emily carefully aligned the torn edges. They matched perfectly. Together they reconstructed nearly the entire message. Daniel described receiving increasing pressure from someone determined to erase every connection between his family and the Calloways. He refused to accept payment or leave voluntarily. He wrote that if anything happened to his repair shop, the silver necklace should remain with his daughter because it represented a promise that true gratitude would eventually find its way home. Emily quietly touched the pendant resting against her sweater. Tears gathered in her eyes, not because the necklace was valuable, but because her father had carried hope inside it until his final days. Margaret reached across the table and gently held Emily's hand. "Your father protected this promise even when he believed we would never find each other again." Emily smiled through quiet emotion. "He never spoke with anger. Even when life became difficult, he always said that bitterness only steals tomorrow from people who already lost yesterday." Ethan looked toward the fireplace where the evening light danced across old family photographs. "Then we will honor him with the truth." Before anyone could continue, Ethan's chief legal advisor entered the library carrying one final document recovered from the archive. It was an internal memorandum signed by Richard Sloane more than 30 years earlier. The short note instructed company staff to stop all attempts to contact Daniel Brooks because he had allegedly declined any future communication with the Calloway family. Margaret slowly shook her head. Thomas would never have stopped searching if he had known that statement was false. Ethan quietly folded the memorandum and placed it beside the reconstructed letter. Every new discovery pointed toward the same painful conclusion. Someone had not merely hidden a friendship. Someone had carefully rewritten history. As the grandfather clock softly marked another passing hour, Richard Sloane sat alone inside his office staring at the locked document box he had protected for decades, unaware that the truth he had spent a lifetime controlling was now only one missing page away from becoming impossible to silence forever. Some promises survive because they are protected by courage. Others survive because someone refuses to stop searching for the truth. The following morning Ethan Calloway arrived at Richard Sloane's office carrying nothing except the reconstructed letter, the archived memorandum, and quiet determination. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking downtown Boston while the city slowly awakened below. Richard welcomed him with the same polished smile he had worn for decades, but the warmth disappeared the moment Ethan placed the documents across the desk. Richard remained silent for several long seconds before carefully reading the familiar handwriting he had hoped never to see again. Ethan finally spoke. "I am not here to accuse you. I am here to understand." Richard slowly removed his glasses and rested them beside the papers. His shoulders seemed older than they had the day before. Some truths become heavier every year they remain hidden. Ethan answered calmly. "Then let them become lighter today." Richard walked toward the window without looking back. 31 years ago your father was preparing to expand the company into several new states. Investors were watching every decision. The accident brought unwanted attention because there were legal questions surrounding the road maintenance contract. If the investigation continued, several important projects would have collapsed. Ethan listened without interruption. Richard continued quietly. Daniel Brooks refused every payment because he believed honesty mattered more than convenience. I admired him for that. I also feared what his testimony might cost the company and everyone working inside it. Ethan frowned. "So you convinced my father that Daniel disappeared willingly?" Richard lowered his head. "I believed I was protecting thousands of employees. Instead you separated two families." Richard closed his eyes. "Yes. Silence settled across the office. There were no raised voices. No dramatic confrontation. Only the quiet weight of a mistake carried for more than 3 decades. Richard slowly unlocked the weathered document box resting inside his cabinet and removed one final sealed envelope. This was meant for your father. I never delivered it. Ethan carefully accepted the envelope without opening it. The handwriting belonged to Daniel Brooks once again. An hour later Ethan invited Emily and Margaret to the conservatory where morning light filled every corner with gentle warmth. Emily looked uncertain as Ethan handed her the final unopened letter. This belongs to your father as much as mine, he said softly. Emily carefully unfolded the fragile paper. Daniel wrote that if anyone ever received the letter, they should never blame those who failed to find him because fear often convinced good people to make poor decisions. He explained that he planned to close the repair shop after developing a serious heart condition and wanted his daughter to grow up free from unnecessary conflict. He asked only one thing. If our families ever meet again, please do not remember me because of what happened on that highway. Remember me because kindness should always travel farther than gratitude. Emily finished reading and quietly wiped a single tear from her cheek. Margaret gently embraced her without speaking. Ethan looked toward the silver necklace resting against Emily's sweater. Your father protected us even after being forgotten. Emily slowly shook her head. He never believed he had been forgotten. He believed people eventually find their way back to the truth. Later that afternoon Emily asked Ethan if they could visit the small cemetery where Daniel Brooks rested. They stood together beneath tall maple trees while a cool autumn breeze carried golden leaves across the quiet grounds. Emily knelt beside the simple headstone and placed fresh white flowers carefully against the polished granite. Ethan remained respectfully a few steps behind. After several peaceful moments Emily unclasped the silver necklace and held it in both hands. She looked at the familiar pendant before turning toward Ethan. Your mother gave this to my father. Maybe it belongs with your family again. Ethan gently closed her hands around the necklace instead of accepting it. No. Emily looked surprised. Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. It stopped belonging to our family the moment Daniel earned it. He transformed a simple piece of silver into something far more valuable. It belongs with the person who carries his legacy now. Emily looked down at the necklace before fastening it once again around her neck. As evening sunlight settled across the cemetery, both of them understood that the mystery surrounding the pendant had finally been solved, yet neither realized the greatest chapter of Daniel Brooks's legacy had not ended with the truth. It was only beginning, because one final decision made on that peaceful autumn afternoon would soon transform an old promise into a future that neither family had ever imagined. A promise becomes real only when someone chooses to live it instead of simply remembering it. The autumn afternoon at Daniel Brooks's gravesite stayed with Ethan Calloway long after the sun disappeared beyond the Boston skyline. As he drove through the quiet streets, he realized that his father had spent years trying to repay a kindness he could never find, while Daniel had spent the rest of his life expecting nothing in return. Somewhere between those two men existed a responsibility that now belonged to him. The following morning Ethan invited Emily Brooks and Margaret Calloway to the headquarters of the Calloway Foundation. Instead of leading them into the executive boardroom, he guided them toward an empty conference hall overlooking the Charles River. Large architectural drawings rested across a long oak table beside notebooks filled with handwritten ideas rather than financial projections. Emily looked from the drawings to Ethan with quiet curiosity. What is all this? Ethan smiled gently. A beginning. Margaret slowly unfolded the largest blueprint. It revealed plans for a community education center connected to vocational training, scholarship programs, family counseling services, and automotive technical workshops designed for young adults who could not afford college. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, illuminating every detail across the table. Emily carefully studied the drawings without speaking. There were classrooms, libraries, workshops, meeting spaces, and gardens instead of luxury offices. Every room seemed designed to welcome people rather than impress them. Ethan quietly watched her expression before speaking again. My father always wanted our company to create opportunities instead of simply creating profit. Somewhere along the way we became too busy measuring success with numbers. Emily looked at the plans once more. And now? Ethan answered honestly. Now I would rather measure success by how many lives leave this building believing in themselves again. Margaret smiled warmly. Your father would have recognized that sentence immediately. Emily slowly traced one finger across the blueprint of the automotive workshop. Why include this? Ethan looked toward her. Because everything started with a mechanic who quietly repaired more than an engine. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment. My father would have laughed if he heard that. Ethan smiled. I hope so. He reached into a folder and removed another document. It contained the proposed name of the project. The Brooks Legacy Center. Emily immediately shook her head. No. Ethan looked surprised. Why? She answered softly. My father never wanted recognition. If his name becomes larger than the purpose, people will miss the lesson he tried to teach. Silence settled across the room as Ethan considered her words. Margaret gently placed her hand over Emily's. Then what would he have wanted? Emily thought quietly before answering. He believed that kindness belonged to everyone. Not just one family. Ethan slowly picked up a pencil and crossed out the original title. After a thoughtful pause he wrote new words across the top of the blueprint. The Shared Promise Center. Emily smiled for the first time since entering the room. That sounds like something he would have loved. During the following weeks architects, educators, and community leaders gathered to refine the plans. Ethan insisted that Emily attend every meeting, not because of her professional background, but because she understood the people the center hoped to serve. She recommended practical ideas no consultant had considered. Comfortable reading corners for children waiting while parents met with counselors. A free evening meal program for working families attending financial literacy classes. Quiet spaces filled with natural light instead of intimidating offices. Every suggestion came from simple observations she had gathered while serving customers at the diner and listening to ordinary conversations over countless cups of coffee. Ethan noticed something remarkable. The more people listened to Emily, the more the project began feeling human instead of corporate. One evening after another planning session ended, the two of them stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the river. The city lights shimmered across the water while a cool breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves through the air. Ethan looked toward the silver necklace resting against Emily's sweater. You know, he said quietly, if my car had not stopped that evening, none of this would exist. Emily smiled gently. Maybe your car did exactly what it was supposed to do. Ethan laughed softly. I never imagined I would owe so much to a loose engine connection. Emily looked toward the river where the reflections of the city danced across the water. Sometimes the smallest repairs changed the longest journeys. Neither of them realized that inside the Callaway Foundation lobby, local reporters had just arrived after hearing rumors about a remarkable new community project, and within the next 24 hours the quiet story of one forgotten mechanic and one ordinary waitress would begin inspiring far more people than either of them had ever believed possible. The greatest legacies are never built from wealth alone. They are built when ordinary people refuse to let extraordinary kindness be forgotten. News about the Shared Promise Center spread across Boston far faster than Ethan Callaway expected. Local newspapers praised the project for focusing on education, family support, skilled trades, and community partnerships instead of publicity. Television stations requested interviews with Ethan, but he accepted only one condition before speaking publicly. Every interview had to include Emily Brooks. She quietly declined every invitation. People should hear about the center, she told him with a gentle smile. They do not need to hear about me. Ethan respected her decision, yet he understood something the cameras could never capture. The project carried her influence through every hallway, every classroom, and every idea written across the architectural plans. Several months later construction reached its final stage. Bright autumn sunlight reflected across newly installed windows while landscapers planted maple trees around peaceful walking paths connecting each building. Emily visited the site after finishing another shift at the diner, still wearing her simple uniform beneath a light sweater. Workers greeted her warmly because many of them already knew the story behind the center. She thanked every carpenter, electrician, painter, and gardener individually, believing that every contribution deserved recognition. Ethan watched quietly from across the courtyard. One construction supervisor approached him and smiled. She thanks people the same way your employees say you changed after meeting her. Ethan looked toward Emily helping volunteers arrange books inside the children's reading room. Then perhaps we are finally learning from the right teacher. On the morning of the opening ceremony, hundreds of families gathered outside the entrance beneath clear blue skies. Children laughed while volunteers welcomed guests with warm coffee, fresh pastries, and handwritten maps of the new center. The building looked elegant without feeling intimidating. Large windows invited sunlight into every room. Comfortable chairs replaced formal waiting areas. Fresh flowers stood beside the reception desk instead of expensive decorations. Near the entrance rested a modest bronze plaque carrying only one sentence. Every act of kindness begins with someone willing to stop and help. Emily read the words quietly before looking toward Ethan. That sounds like my father. Ethan smiled. It sounds like you both. During the ceremony, community leaders praised the project, educators spoke about opportunity, and families shared stories of hope. When the master of ceremonies invited Ethan to the podium, the audience applauded warmly. Ethan stood before the microphone, looked across the crowd for several silent moments, and then stepped away from the podium. Instead he walked toward Emily, who stood near the back beside several volunteers. He gently invited her to stand beside him. Emily hesitated before joining him. Ethan faced the audience once more. Many people believe successful projects begin with money, he said calmly. This one began because a waitress walking home after work chose to stop beside a broken car instead of walking past it. She expected nothing. She asked for nothing. She simply helped another person. Everything you see around you grew from that single decision. The crowd turned toward Emily with quiet admiration. She looked slightly embarrassed and answered softly into the microphone. If my father were standing here, he would remind all of us that none of this happened because of one person. It happened because kindness kept traveling from one life to another until it reached all of us. The audience responded with heartfelt applause that seemed to last much longer than either of them expected. Margaret Calloway watched from the front row with grateful eyes, quietly holding a framed photograph of Daniel Brooks beside one of Thomas Calloway. The two photographs rested together for the first time in more than 30 years. As the ceremony ended, children rushed into the library while young adults explored the vocational workshops and parents met with counselors inside welcoming family rooms. The building immediately became exactly what everyone had hoped it would become. Late that afternoon, Emily stood alone in the peaceful garden behind the center where golden leaves drifted slowly across the stone pathway. She touched the familiar silver necklace resting against her sweater and smiled gently. It no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It had become a quiet reminder that one ordinary act of kindness could continue changing lives long after the people who first inspired it were gone, and as the evening sun settled across the gardens, Ethan quietly began preparing one final surprise that would ensure Daniel Brooks's promise continued reaching generations yet to come. The most valuable inheritance is never placed inside a safe. It lives inside the choices people continue making long after the original gift was given. 3 years passed quietly, and the Shared Promise Center became one of the most trusted community organizations in Massachusetts. Every week families filled the classrooms, children discovered new books inside the bright library, skilled instructors guided young mechanics through hands-on training, and volunteers welcomed every visitor with the same warmth that had inspired the center from the very beginning. Emily Brooks still worked several shifts each week at the neighborhood diner even though she now helped oversee many of the center's outreach programs. Whenever someone asked why she never left the job that first connected her to Ethan Calloway, she simply smiled and answered, "This is where I learned that every conversation can change a life." Nothing about her kindness became larger after recognition arrived. If anything, it became even quieter. Ethan visited the center almost every afternoon after finishing meetings across the city. Employees often found him speaking with students in the automotive workshop, listening to parents describe their hopes for their children, or helping volunteers carry boxes of donated books into the library. His expensive suits remained the same, but something inside him had changed forever. Success no longer meant standing above other people. It meant standing beside them whenever they needed encouragement. One crisp October afternoon, the center welcomed its 20,000th visitor. Instead of planning a grand celebration, Emily suggested inviting every volunteer, teacher, maintenance worker, gardener, and cafeteria employee to a simple community dinner. Buildings never change lives, she quietly reminded everyone. People do. That evening laughter filled the courtyard beneath strings of warm lights while children played beneath the maple trees that had grown tall since the center first opened. Margaret Calloway sat peacefully near the garden, watching several generations share meals around long wooden tables. She looked toward Ethan and smiled. "Your father spent years searching for one good man. He never imagined that one good man would inspire thousands more." Ethan gently nodded before looking across the courtyard toward Emily, who was helping an elderly guest carry a tray rather than standing with honored visitors. She had not changed. The world around her had. After dinner, Ethan quietly invited everyone toward the small memorial garden behind the center. A single stone pathway led beneath rows of flowering trees until it reached a simple bronze sculpture shaped like two hands passing a small pendant from one generation to the next. There were no names carved into the sculpture. Only a short inscription beneath it. "Kindness travels farther than those who begin it." Emily slowly reached for the silver necklace resting against her sweater. She looked at the sculpture before turning toward Ethan. "You never told me about this." Ethan smiled gently. "Because I wanted it to belong to everyone, not to one family." Margaret quietly stepped forward carrying the old photograph of Daniel Brooks and Thomas Calloway standing together decades earlier. She placed the framed picture beside the sculpture. "They finally found each other again," she whispered. A peaceful silence settled across the garden as autumn leaves drifted through the fading sunlight. No speeches followed. No cameras interrupted the moment. Families simply stood together, understanding that some stories were too meaningful to require applause. As the evening came to an end, Emily and Ethan walked slowly toward the front entrance where they had first imagined the future years earlier. The windows glowed warmly behind them while volunteers locked the classrooms one by one. Ethan looked at the familiar necklace resting against Emily's heart. "If your father could see this place today, what do you think he would say?" Emily smiled toward the children waving goodbye from across the courtyard. "He would probably remind us that tomorrow someone else will need help. Then he would tell us not to be late." Ethan laughed softly before opening the front gate for one final family leaving the center. As the gate quietly closed behind them, the silver pendant reflected the last light of the setting sun, no longer carrying the weight of an unanswered mystery but the quiet certainty that one ordinary act of kindness had crossed decades, united two families, transformed countless futures, and proved forever that the greatest treasures are never measured by what they are worth, but by how many lives they gently inspire to become kinder than they were the day before.